Look, learning has fundamentally changed. And that's a scary thing to say, and it's a broad thing to say, but I can prove it to you really quickly. And I can prove it to you quickly by saying in the past, learning was a measurement of how much you had in your head, because acquiring new knowledge was difficult. You probably had to drive to your local library, find a book, absorb the information, and then record that information in some fashion that allowed you to recall it later. That was the way obtaining knowledge worked from the dawn of history until recently. And the only thing that changed was it was easier to print books and it was easier to get to the books. That meant that knowing answers was important, because if you had that, it shortened the time to access the knowledge. From a very purely functional, practical standpoint, it meant that in a business world, in a practical world, in a world where you had to use knowledge to do anything, the more knowledge you had in your head, the better, because you would access it faster. Speed is always an advantage in almost anything practically. That's not the way the world works anymore.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are starting in this episode a series of episodes where we're going to be diving into some of the important topics that we talk about here at Unbound as part of our educational framework. But before you think, oh, this is just them talking a little bit about just what they do and why it's so great, and just kind of dismiss it as more of a, oh, this is a promotional podcast, we think that these kinds of concepts are valuable because these are the concepts that are just true of the world today, and we just happen to use it in a context of the education that we provide young adults in Unbound. And so, Jonathan, I'll kind of kick it over to you to kind of expound on that a little bit further, but just to give the audience a little bit of a primer for what we're going to be talking about here, we call it the adult model, is what we're going to be specifically focusing on for the next few episodes of the podcast. And so, Jonathan, give us a little bit more context on how we came up with that and why it's important.
Yeah, so this is a fun topic for us to talk about. In fact, it comes at a time where we're just finishing convention season. A lot of us have been speaking often on these topics, which is why they're top of our minds. And I'll give a version of what I do at the beginning of our talks that we do live in presentations. Start first with this, which is a quote that we throw out a lot of times, which is, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. And there's an important distinction. The model we're about to share with you is not gospel truth. And what I mean by that is that there are things that are true no matter what. And then there are perspectives at getting at things that are true no matter what. This is the latter. This is our attempt at providing a perspective on some things that we think are true. It's a model. And so in that sense, it's fallible. And we know it's fallible because we did some episodes on this years ago, and this is different now. You'll see, if you listen to both those episodes, you'll find a lot of things in common, but there's some nuances, there's some changes, there's some upgrades, and there's some updates. And so, obviously you don't change things that are true no matter what, right? So this is an understanding of something that's true, and that's really helpful. The second thing is just why we came at this. I tell people when I speak, it's not that I'm particularly important or smarter than anybody else in my audience. It's just that the topic I'm speaking on, I just happen to get to spend all my time focusing on. So David and I get paid to work with young adults in the period of life from about 13, 14 to 25, with a real emphasis on 18 to 25-year-olds. And so we get to see a lot of students in that process. We get to see them go through, and we see them learn, succeed, fail, recover, do all those things. That's our job. That's what we get paid to do every single day. And in my case, is what I've been paid to do in some fashion for now more than 26 years. So when you see that, you see patterns, you see repetitions, and we happen to be in a spot where we can take those patterns and repetitions, build a model that is useful, and then apply it in what we do for a living here at Unbound. But it's also useful for anybody, whether you're in Unbound or not, to be able to observe these things, that this is a perspective on things that are true no matter what.
Yeah, we're just in a very unique position where, these are not new ideas. There are plenty of people who are far smarter than us who probably came up with these ideas long before we did. We're just in a position where we're noticing it in a specific context and we're applying it in a specific context, but we think that these ideas, generally speaking, are helpful for pretty much anybody who's alive in the year 2025 and probably beyond.
Exactly. So, with that preamble, let's talk about the adult model. So adult is an acronym that stands for ask, do, understand, live, and thrive. And we actually use it as the educational framework for Unbound. And what that means is that when we produce content for our students in Unbound, for our high school programs through our post-high school programs, those educational pieces all have to have a component of ask, do, understand, live, and thrive. Those pieces have to build into one of those components. They have to include some of those components. We evaluate them in that kind of structure. And so that's how we use it internally. But I would suggest, as David just said, that if you're learning anything in 2025, it's important to go through this process. And so with that introduction, we want to talk about Ask Today, which I don't know about David, probably one of my favorite ones to talk about.
I fully agree. Yep.
Yeah, it's the one that I think we get some value in it. People, and this is the fun part to me. When we present this, people go, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, that makes so much sense. I hadn't thought about it that way, and now this changes everything. Well, that's fun, right? So that's why we like this one so much. So let me take you through the process. If you were recently at any events and you came to this podcast because you heard me speak live, you heard this already. So, hang with me for the next 30 seconds or a minute or two, and then we'll go into it a little deeper than we did in any of the sessions. But we tell people, look, learning has fundamentally changed. And that's a scary thing to say, and it's a broad thing to say, but I can prove it to you really quickly. And I can prove it to you quickly by saying in the past, learning was a measurement of how much you had in your head, because acquiring new knowledge was difficult. It required expense, it required travel, it required recording it in some fashion. And what I mean by that is if you didn't know something, you probably had to drive to your local library, find a book, absorb the information, and then record that information in some fashion that allowed you to recall it later. That was the way obtaining knowledge worked from the dawn of history until recently. And the only thing that changed was it was easier to print books and it was easier to get to the books, right? But you still had to do both of those. That meant that knowing answers was important. In other words, having a sort of storehouse of facts and information in your brain was important, because if you had that, it shortened the time to access the knowledge. And in a business, we could talk about the inherent goodness of knowing knowledge and all those kinds of things, those important discussions. But from a very purely functional, practical standpoint, it meant that in a business world, in a practical world, in a world where you had to use knowledge to do anything, the more knowledge you had in your head, the better, because you would access it faster. Speed is always an advantage in almost anything practically. Okay, That's not the way the world works anymore. If you're accessing this, you're probably listening to us almost certainly on a phone. If you're listening to us on that phone delivers to you almost the entirety of the world's knowledge and measurements of fractions of seconds.
Here's the fun way that I look at it to explain this well, is that you know how back in the day when you were in a math class and the teacher wouldn't allow you to use a calculator and you got really annoyed, and the teacher said, like, well, you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket. And it's been sort of a meme over the last decade or so. It's just like, oh, now all of us are walking around with calculators in our pockets. So that's accelerated now to the point where not only are we walking around with calculators in our pockets, we're walking around with encyclopedias that have the wealth of the vast majority of the world's information on them. So at this point, we not only have a calculator, we have a whole wealth of basically all of the books in human existence in our pocket. So that's the big shift there that I think is a really fun way to put it.
And if you think about the power of having a calculator in your pocket in terms of how that adjusts your ability to do math, and to both positively and negatively, right? And now to apply that to almost the entirety of knowledge, that's a fairly stunning and fundamental development. And so what we teach our students, and what I would suggest to you, is that what that means functionally is that you don't live in an answers-based paradigm anymore. You live in a questions-based paradigm. And what we mean by that is that in terms of functional knowledge, now again, there's a different argument for the necessity of knowing knowledge, for the beauty and the importance of knowing knowledge, that has not changed. I would argue to you that that's more of a fundamental truth. I'm speaking purely, let's make sure we stay in our lane here. We're talking purely about functional knowledge, right? The knowledge that you're going to use to do something in the business world in any kind of, practical sense. Then the paradigm we live in now is a questions-based paradigm, which means the ability to ask a question is almost more important than knowing the answer, maybe more important than knowing the answer, because you have access to the entirety of the world's information. Now you have to sort it. And a good question sorts that. Now, you have to have enough knowledge to judge the accuracy of the responses that you're getting. Believe it or not, to you, not everything you want on the internet is not true. AI does lie. I mean, fundamental knowledge is still important, and we're not saying that it's not. But we're saying from a functional standpoint, which is why I argue this way. From elementary school, so K through 12, I think you should be focused on gaining knowledge. It is still very much an answers-based paradigm. What is really fundamentally different here is that what would happen before was that answers-based paradigm would continue. In other words, you would continue out of an answers-based paradigm into a world that would double down on the answers-based paradigm through college, perhaps through post-college studies. And then there was an equality here. It's like the letters behind your name equaled your functional, practical ability in the job. And our argument is that, K through 12, you definitely still need to focus on that knowledge piece. But post-12, And even in 9 through 12, you ought to be learning about questions. And post 12, it almost entirely should be focused on how do you sort information? How do you learn new information? How do you gauge what is accurate and how do you apply that? Which is almost always a function of asking good questions. So that kind of lays out what we mean by ask. And David, I know we've talked about this a lot, but when you think about this in terms of how it relates to, maybe even your world and your job or the kind of things you observe, put some practical flesh on these bones, past the theoretical.
Yeah, so I think it's really just such a fundamental shift. Like once you recognize the fact that this is the way the world works now, it just makes so much sense in that there's so much of the time where in just your day-to-day life at this point, instead of trying to figure out how to do something, you just figure out what question you need to ask in order to get the information that you need. Now, there's obviously just the very obvious answers of, at this point, Googling things has been around for, 10, 15 years at this point. And at this point now, like even I, in my job, I'm asking AI how to troubleshoot different tasks. And so quite literally at this point with AI, you're learning how to ask good questions because you're figuring out how to like prompt the AI in such a way that it's going to be able to help you figure things out. But I think even more than that, the relevant question now is, you alluded to it earlier, that there is so much information that is so quickly accessible. Now, I think the really important skill that I think we're seeing a lot of struggle in our society over is sorting through what information is true and what information is important and valuable. What information should I actually be taking in and then, altering how I live my life because it's a very overwhelming prospect for most of us now, in that, especially those of us who grew up with the internet, that you can go on the internet and you can find somebody that says something, is on a polar opposite sides of pretty much any issue. 99.9% of people agree with one statement. You can always go to the internet and find somebody who agrees with the total opposite. And so there's some points where, this is probably the majority of people are correct, and there's some where the minority seems like they're more correct. And so understanding how to actually filter that out and how to kind of have the wisdom to discern what knowledge is actually valuable when you have that wealth of information, I think is a really important aspect of it. So that's what immediately comes to mind for me. I'd be curious, Jonathan, on kind of to get a little bit more of an expansion on your thoughts of like why like the questions-based paradigm is just such a helpful tool in being able to kind of address that issue.
Yeah, and maybe before that, I wanted David to sort of talk about the practical aspect of it because, often when audiences hear that, they go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That reflects what I'm seeing in life. And again, this is not us claiming some new knowledge or some sort of secret information. This is more, we get an opportunity and maybe a space to reflect on this. And often when I see the power of this is when people go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I see that. Now I know how to sort of understand what is happening around me a little bit better. I want to go almost a little more metaphysical first before we kind of put some more practical pieces in there. And I just want to make an argument for, often the attack here is that, well, a questions-based paradigm sounds like you're always questioning, like, almost like the 2-year-old, why, right? And it's one of the things that we teach our students, and I think it's a helpful thing to think about here, is that we ask better questions to get more information. And there's a continuation here that is actually transcends just the moment that we're in. This is not just a technological result. I think this is actually something a little bit fundamentally deeper. One of the things that happens in the past kind of era that we just left in terms of, access to information is that we had good access to information and we had maybe a heightened ability to memorize that information. But there's a inherent limit in that kind of model in that, knowing the answer puts you in a position to kind of say, I know it, I'm done. And so you would see this in the fact that people thought, I earn a college degree, it translates into a job. I earn a master's degree, it translates into a better job. I earn a PhD, it translates into a better job. You'd see it, right. Very transactional. You'd see it in games like Trivial Pursuit. Like that your worth is determined by knowing the answer, but you don't have to do anything with the answer. You just have to know the answer. And so what would happen is that an answers-based paradigm actually sort of stalls learning. I know the answer. Stop. I'm done. Right? And a questions-based paradigm is more, we ask a question so we get an answer. So, we're not just asking the questions, we want an answer. And we get and when we find an answer, it gives us a place to ask a better question. Now, that kind of idea is an idea of continual, constant, nonstop learning. That eliminate the college degree or go past the college degree. We're not talking about a credential here. We're not talking about transactional. We're talking about a whole system of learning that doesn't ever end. That and we would argue from the practical standpoint, that's because technology continually disrupts. And so whatever you know now, you're going to have to relearn in some different fashion in the future as technology disrupts. AI takes this job or transforms this one. That doesn't mean that it's all going to be bad. It just means that you're going to constantly have to learn to move forward. I would make an even deeper argument, which is this ought to make sense to us as people of faith from a practical faith standpoint, in that we follow an eternal God that we claim and say is bigger than us and that we'll never fully understand. His ways are not our ways. And so consequently, we're constantly asking questions about who God is. We're getting an answer. And when we get to that answer, we realize that we're on a place to ask a better question and there's more to learn. And I've described this as, now, always a little careful here. Are you saying that there's, shades of more? No, there are ultimate truth. There is right and wrong. We're not making moral arguments here. But I would say from a moral argument standpoint, let's, there's an answer. Should I cheat on my wife? The answer is no. Okay. That's very easy to understand. It does not need more explanation than that. There's not a shade there. On the other hand, why don't I cheat on my wife? Right? Well, because God said so is a solid answer and all you need in terms of practically live. Okay. We start there. But I would say that 26 years into marriage later, I understand that at a much deeper level than I did when I started. It hasn't changed my opinion about what, the moral question one little bit. In fact, it's reinforced it and made it even deeper. But my understanding of what it means in that sense and the importance of that and the nuances of that has just gotten richer and deeper and deeper and deeper as I go forward. And I'm continually asking that question, not because I'm looking for an answer different, but because I'm looking for more understanding, and doing so enriches my life in a whole level of other things. And, we would say that about all kinds of things. And then I would go on to say that, that would be true also in the fact that we follow an eternal God and we expect to spend eternity with him. And so that means, in my mind, that we are going to spend an eternity asking questions and getting better answers. And so this is a really good time to practice. So those are some thoughts to kind of, why this is true on not just a practical level, maybe more so now than any other time, but this is more of a universal thing in that, this asking questions in a process of continual learning is a reality for us because of the faith we proclaim and the reality that we live in.
Yeah, I think the another word that you can use for this is just curiosity, really. You mentioned the example of the 2-year-old that is incessantly asking questions earlier. And there's a part of that where we imagine that and we think, okay, yeah, that's kind of annoying. But also, we see that, and when you actually think about it, you go, but that's good. That's like a 2-year-old is at a point in life where they are able to understand, they have a little more context, and they have enough knowledge and enough brain capacity to be able to see the world and go, whoa, there is a lot that I don't understand. There's a lot that I want to understand. Let me go to the person who I know is going to be able to help me and get the answers that I need so that I can understand the world that I'm in. And that is a really good thing. And I think curiosity is something that I think, and like I mentioned earlier, you can find people who disagree, but I think just about universally, everybody can say is a pretty good thing to have, not only when you're young, but continuing on into adulthood, to be constantly learning and growing and understanding more and more new things. And I think in addition to that, I really appreciated your point about the fact that we as Christians are always going to be learning because of how God has designed us. And I think Scripture supports that fact in constantly encouraging us to be dwelling on just sort of the core principles of faith. And the core principles of our Christian faith are pretty relatively simple to understand. It's pretty easy to communicate the core tenets of the Christian faith in a very small amount of time, and it's fairly easy to comprehend. But the amount of depth that is there when you continue asking questions of but what does this mean, especially when you take it into the full counsel of Scripture, to use the theological term, is that there is so much depth and richness, and you not only come to understand more of who God is, and then you get to understand more of who you are in relation to God, and then how to relate to others well out of that, so out of some very simple truths, if you continue practicing curiosity, you can experience a whole depth of growth in your faith that you wouldn't experience if you just sat and accepted that. And yeah, I think scripture encourages us to constantly be growing in our faith. And I think curiosity is a really key component of that.
So if that's the case and questions-based paradigm is important, then, the question that we have to ask as people who work in an educational company, right? And that you need to ask in terms of somebody who wants to learn, or maybe if you're a parent and you're teaching, is it what's the practical reality of this?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I would do is just lay up a contrast. A traditional school system is very much an answers-based system. Well, how do we know that? Well, because we gauge it by answers. We gauge it by, can I ask a question and then do you have the answer? Do you take a test and do you know the answers? Do you take a quiz? Do you know the answers? And it lends itself to this idea that if I know the answers, that's it. And it's also like when the test is over, I'm done. Like I got an A in the class, I'm finished. I don't need to apply this knowledge anymore. So we think the contrast to that is a project-based education system where what we're doing is we're saying, imagine with me an outcome. Now figure out the gap in between. And your success is measured by your ability to close the gap between where you are and where you want the outcome to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a straight up project, and we've referenced this before, but, we were in a program at what we call Ridgeline in January, and we had students do projects. And one of the project was to build a sailboat and learn to sail it. Okay, well, an answers-based thing would be like, we're going to have a series of tests. We're going to test on, what are the designs of boats? How do you sail? All these things. You fill out the test, you get the answers and all this stuff. So that would be an answers-based paradigm. Well, a questions-based paradigm was a project-based paradigm, where a project-based education system, where we said, okay, you've now imagined that you want to, the real outcome is you want to sail a boat. And then more specifically, you want to sail a boat that you made. All right. That we've framed that up. Now go. And there was, now to be clear, there was no instruction past that from an expert who knew the answers. Instead, there was a pressure on students to, well, you need to start to research what kind of boats are you able to build. Well, that means that you have to ask questions about constraints. Well, you have 3 days. Well, what about budget? Well, how much money can you raise? And so we have a small budget and we have a small amount of time. Well, that means we're not building a, 3-masted schooner that we're going to sail to England. I mean, that's not going to be possible, right? And so that kind of shrinks it down. Well, then, okay, where are the materials? How does it go? Well, we have to research plans. Well, then once we have the plans picked, we have to research materials that we need. Well, how much is that going to cost? How's that fit in? Okay, what are the skills that we need? Who are the people that we're going to have to talk to that can teach us the skills we don't know? How many of those skills can we actually learn? We're going to need a sail. Who's in charge of figuring that out? Oh, look, we have somebody in our team that actually knows how to sail. She can teach the rest of us how to sail once we have the boat. All of those are a questions-based paradigm. And so one of the things that we would tell folks is if you're thinking about a questions-based paradigm, think about creating those gaps. Now, remember the timing here. A kindergartner needs to know 2 + 2 = 4, period. And they need to learn math. You don't get to take a shortcut on that, right? But starting in high school, you ought to be given projects that require you to use math to solve them. So you have to then fill in the gaps with math. A young person needs to know that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. An older student should be asked, how was Napoleon defeated at Waterloo? And then they should they should be in charge of investigating and figuring out, well, how was it? And where did they come from? And where's Waterloo anyhow? And who was involved? And what were the armies? And what was the role artillery played? And what about the cavalry charge? And all those kinds of things. That's a questions-based thing, right? Young people need to know how to spell and how to use grammar. When you get older, you should be said, what would it be like? Can you write a poem? Can you write a short story? Can you write a whatever? Now you have to put all those pieces together. That's the difference between sort of project-based education, but more importantly, a questions-based paradigm where you're creating this gap where somebody has to ask questions and seek and find the knowledge to do that. And, remember, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that might have been too tall of an order in somebody that had limited supplies in the library and whatever that is. Now, that's a totally different thing because one of the marvels of our modern age is that, a bunch of kids who had never even seen a boat before, that, had not ever considered building a boat before, I should say, not seen a boat before, never considered building a boat before, in relatively short order, was able to sort through an enormous amount of information and go, oh, people build boats. People build boats that don't cost very much. People build boats that sail. People built this boat. We can pick this boat. That's what's possible. That 40 years ago, if I told kids to build a boat and they went to the library, there might have been one book in there and it would have been how to build that 3-masted schooner, which is not a practical result. Now it's different.
it has to be linked to the result ultimately. Like that's what makes it so practical, is that you're asking questions so that you can ultimately attain a result. And sometimes the result might be, I want to understand this better so that I can have a fuller understanding of this and be prepared when it goes wrong or something like that. Like there's a lot of things, since I work with technology all the time, a lot of the time I actually spend a decent amount of the time just asking how new technology works, not necessarily because I'm going to do anything with it, but so that in case that technology ends up coming up in my day-to-day life, or in case, I need to help a family member or a colleague when their technology breaks, it's helpful for me to have the understanding and the context of how that works, and so that I can then go and solve that problem and I can assist with that. And it's really easy to overlook the value of just going and saying like, okay, this, when I click this button, it does this. And now for me, at least, I found it really interesting to go, okay, how does that work? Why does that work? And that's a really practical thing in my particular case that I'm able to then use to help other people. And then you can apply that to so many different fields. And I think that's one of the ways that young people that, we focus on training in Unbound can end up standing out a lot from their peers, is that a lot of their peers will go into job training situations. They'll get trained how to do their very specific task that the company is wanting them to do. And then they'll say, okay, I know how to do this one specific task. And that's it. Whereas people who are operating out of a questions-based paradigm and are looking to apply that in their jobs are going to look at that one task that they're trained to do and go, okay, this is the one task that I'm trained on how to do. What are the results of that? What are the steps before my task? What are the steps afterwards? How can I make the whole process more efficient? How can I, take all of the, make sure that everything that happens before I come in works better? How can I see the full picture of it? And who are the people that I'm helping with this task? And just asking a lot of those questions that ultimately leads to an attitude of excellence that allows them to perform in their jobs so much better than the vast majority of their peers.
I agree with that. And also, one of the questions we teach our students to ask is who, not how. And so for me, when it comes to the technological questions that David was asking about, the question is always, how fast can I call David? Or where's David? Because who already asked the question about how this all works, and so he knows what's went wrong, he can fix it. So there is another piece of this that's important to know, and that is, it is true that a questions-based paradigm can lead you down some dark paths. And what I mean by that is that you can get confused and you can ask questions just for the sake of asking questions, and it's a continuation of the 3-year-old asking why all the time, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not really asking why because you want to know. You're asking why because you're appreciating getting the goat of the parent, right? I mean, there's an aspect of that there. And so one of the contexts that we think is really important, and I would share with you and we share with our students all the time, is that as Christians, we're in a questions-based paradigm where we know the purpose. What is the purpose? The purpose is to understand more about what is true. Now, we also remember, as people of faith, we think truth is defined in a person named Jesus the Christ, right? So I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I mean, this is an ultimate truth. This is not a question. This is a something that's extremely knowable, but is also simply knowable. I can tell it to you as simply as that sentence, and yet infinitely knowable in that we're going to spend eternity knowing what that actually means. And so that means we teach students, you have to ask questions inside that context with that purpose. And you say, well, I mean, like if we're learning about Waterloo, yes, we absolutely are asking about how does this relate to bigger things. And let me do that by contrasting the other way, right? This is a bit of a soapbox for me, but I'm beyond appalled. And I think that as a society, we don't have the faintest inkling of the Pandora's box we've opened at the proliferation of gambling in all its forms, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can ask questions about gambling, and those questions could be, this is a gambling platform. How can I maximize my earnings on this gambling platform? Okay, that's a questions-based paradigm. That's seeking knowledge. But you're failing to ask knowledge in terms of helping me to get closer to the truth. And so the real answer here is that the more questions you ask about how to make gambling work for you, the less you're actually understanding truth and the more you're being led astray, because the reality of gambling is the house always wins. And so that path is almost always destruction, right? And so instead, when we're faced with the gambling things, we need to be asking questions that start looking for truth. Is like, what is who wins in this? Who is hurt by this? What are the implications of these things? So those kinds of big questions. And we think that the ask paradigm also means asking and answering the big questions. And, really big questions. Why am I here? What happens to me when I'm die? What is the purpose of my life? And that when we're confronted with anything, that we have to sort of relate what we're doing to those big questions. I have an opportunity to get $500 bonus if I sign up for this gambling app. Okay, well, let's start with, what is the purpose of gambling? Who gets hurt by doing this? Who benefits from this? What are the outcomes of this? What is the best possible outcome? What is the worst possible outcome? Okay, those are all questions-based paradigm, but that's a questions-based paradigm that works inside of understanding truth with a capital T, right? That we're putting this in the context of what we believe and what we live and what we know to be true. And then we're asking questions that lead us down that path further, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Context, I think, is the really big word there. And I think this will probably lead pretty naturally into our next episode where we talk about understand here soon. But yeah, you have to ask questions. And then once you get those answers, then build off of that. I think what you're pushing back against is, I think, a lot of the sort of nihilistic term of just like, oh, we can't know anything. And,
Right.
We are just asking questions for the sake of asking questions and just accelerating that. It's just, we're asking questions because we believe there are answers. And once we get those answers, then we can build on that and ask further questions that we can get more and more answers. The goal is ultimately to get answers for the questions and to get knowledge that we can put in our head. But it's supposed to create momentum. It's not supposed to just be this thing where we're just zooming out further and further with asking these questions and ultimately getting overwhelmed, because a lot of the time, like, that's not actually very productive or helpful for us. It just ends up leading to confusion. If you're in the position, though, where you look and you say, there is an answer to this question, maybe it's really hard to find, and maybe it's going to take me a while to actually get to the point where I can find this answer. And maybe I have to ask some other people who have wrestled with this question longer than I have. Maybe I need to find some people to help me think through this, but ultimately knowing that you can find the answer to the question.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point, David, is that, you had an interesting line there, knowing that there is an answer. That is a function of our faith. We believe in a rational God who made all things. Therefore, we do believe there's answers to all questions. Some of those answers are, don't go here. That's not a plea for ignorance. That's a understanding that the answers here lead us away from truth, right? I mean, I have to frame that differently. I don't, that accidentally implies that there's things that we don't want to know about, and that's kind of a plea for ignorance. I'm not making any plea for ignorance. It's that it's the plea to always contextualize what we're asking. Is this true, or is this more information about a lie? You can learn a lot about a lie, right? And so, am I learning more about a lie, or am I learning more about a truth? Which direction am I going with this? And that is important, but that ultimately we do believe there are answers to those questions, even to the very point that there is such a thing as a truth and a lie. And that is honestly, it's a very Western civilization type thing. So there's a real historical grounding there. But it is absolutely a Western civilization thing because of our faith. Out of the Judeo-Christian faith comes this idea that a rational God that created all things means that one is able to think God's thoughts after him, especially if made in the image of God, which means we can seek answers and expect to find them. And that's an exciting thing. But it also means that we are literally people of question. We're people of a questions-based paradigm. And it just so happens that we live in a time where that's even more apparent. And from a practical standpoint, knowing that will help you not only, to order your life well and to understand your faith better, but also to practically live your life in a way that's more useful because of the fast-moving nature of the information age that we're in, and the fast-moving disruption of technology, and the need to always kind of adjust to that.
I think that rounds it out really well. So tell you what, Jonathan, I'll take a quick stab at trying to summarize just what we've talked about.
David is back in the summarizing spot. This is probably better for everybody, including our listeners. Go for it, David.
So really just what we're talking about when we say that ask is the foundation of our educational framework and the start of our adult model is that previously knowledge has been part of an answers-based paradigm where the more answers you had, the more facts you had in your head, the more of an advantage that you would have. Today, with the democratization of knowledge, that's no longer the case because anyone can look up just about any sort of knowledge that they want to, so that's not really an advantage. The advantage is being able to ask questions, to take that knowledge, to look at it and say, what can I do with this? Look for the result that you're trying to achieve and try to find the questions to get the right pieces of knowledge that you need to be able to find that. And that helps us to be able to practice curiosity as God has intended for us to do, to explore his creation, to understand more about who he is and who we are and how to operate and live well in the world that he's created us to be in, and how to benefit others that he has placed us in context of. How can we ask questions that will lead us to answers that will benefit us and benefit the communities that he has put us in? That is ultimately what we hope for when we encourage our students to ask good questions.
Well, as always, I think that's an excellent summary. If you're interested in the things that we're talking about, and if you're interested in how that applies to our particular educational program, of course, we invite you to go check out beunbound.us. We highlight some of our programs each time we do an episode, and this is the time of year when we spend a lot of time talking about Ascend, because we're getting ready to finalize the Ascend class in these next few months. And so if you're interested in Ascend, now is definitely the time to talk to our counselors and get that all rolling. One interesting aspect that's happened recently is that, if you've seen any of our information, or if you've been at recent conventions, you know that if you are in Ascend for 3 years and you earn all 3 certificates, which ultimately then grants our full Ascend certificate, that we guarantee employment, or we refund all 3 years of your tuition. And so people often ask about that. Obviously, it's a fun thing to say for us. It gets people's attention. We absolutely mean it. And we say it for 2 reasons. One, we've never had to refund any money. We have no problems getting our students hired for a variety of reasons. 2, it makes us accountable. It means that we have to develop models like this, and we have to fill them out well, and we have to teach our students real skills, and we have to be able to connect them to people that can help with those skills. But one of the interesting things that's happened is that right now we have just exponentially more open positions than we have students to fill. In other words, I could have our entire class, from our first-year students to our 3-year students, hired just in terms of slots open and students available. And so we have approximately 10 or 11 times more open positions in our kind of people that talk to us and say, would love to hire your students, than we have students available. And in fact, just this week, I've met with several people who basically are like, I really want to hire your students. And so I'm in this interesting situation that I really want you to enroll, because I have a lot of employers at the other end that are desperate for your talent, and I don't have enough students to fill all the positions that are open. And I just think about what is the impact on the world. We know the value of our students. We know the kinds of people that come to our program. We know the things they can do. We know there are people out there doing really good stuff, running awesome businesses, really creating services and creating value in the world, and they need your talent. And we simply don't have enough people to fill those positions. So if that sounds interesting to you, we've got a spot for you, literally in the class and at the other end when you graduate. And so go to beunbound.us to learn about that and get in touch with us. And we'd love to see you in Michigan in August as we kick off the Ascend year, which is coming up pretty soon. Until then, as always, be unbound.